Hey guys, it's Tom from Ignite. Today we're going to be talking about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and we're going to be breaking down the context of her novel, how it relates to the stuff you're going to be talking about later on as well. So make sure as well, if you like this video, you subscribe to our channel and click on the bell for notifications. So as you can see behind me, the context I've broken down into three different structures. We're going to be talking about the literary context, the social context, and the economic context. And these are important to keep in mind for the way that they these different kinds of contexts will affect the way that you analyze. So firstly, literary analysis. We have to understand the prevailing literary trends that Mary Shelley was both pushing back against and in line with her contemporaries. And sort of where that falls in the timeline of literary theory as well, which will affect a lot of the secondary sources that you guys should be looking into. The social context, this is particularly important because of obviously Mary Shelley's parentage, but also in terms of how this is kind of a depiction of what is kind of a different society from our own in quite a substantial way. So understanding that difference, I think, will be quite important. And then also the economic context, I think, is quite critical to understanding any kind of text as well. So starting with the literary context, Romanticism is the word, the sort of catch cry for understanding Mary Shelley's text in this. So that in terms of both romantic theory, which is, as you can see, sort of the way that you're sort of analysing these texts, and particularly the way that it was seen as sort of a progenitor of humanism and existentialism, but also sort of what's called like literary romanticism and the different themes that meant. So I quite like this quote from Margaret Drabble, who's an academic. She sort of discusses the different ways that romanticism is manifested as a political idea, as an emotional idea, and as a literary idea. Politically, it was kind of the driving force, I think, behind the American and French revolutions. But in a specific literary context, what we mean by romanticism is a kind of rejection of the sort of Renaissance and Enlightenment period rationality, hyper-rationality. So this is where you see like scientific empiricism and the growing strength of science and the sort of these tenets of like sort of empirical liberal thought. And what romanticism is something of a nostalgia, but it's kind of a callback to this sort of love of nature, of sort of the beauty of the natural world, of myth and mythology, of kind of alchemy, and sort of these are a lot of the ideas that are encaptured when we talk about Enlightenment in a particularly sort of a literary context. And this obviously draws upon a lot of like social and political ideas, particularly if you think about, as we'll discuss in, say, the economic context, if you talk about sort of the prevalence of the slave trade, and sort of Mary Shelley's role in advocating against the slave trade. But I think it's important to understand, firstly, the way that Romanticism as sort of the prevailing contextual force that will supplement your analysis of this text. So that's important to recognize. The second is the social context. So some background on Mary Shelley, as you may or may not know. Her mother was Mary Wollstonecraft, who was what we call a proto-feminist. So this Shelley's work predates what is seen as like the first feminist movement, which is the first suffragette movement. So Shelley still emerged from a proto-feminist cradle, essentially. Her mother wrote this extended tract on sort of a vindication on the rights of women. I've included a sort of a quote there, but you can understand the way that this is obviously reflected in the different characters and the roles that are adopted within Shelley's Frankenstein. Particularly, I think this is most important to understand this context and the way that it works in terms of this idea of birth. This becomes sort of a central fixation of a lot of characters, is this idea of natural human birth versus the unnatural birth of the monster via Victor Frankenstein's methods. And so you can understand this kind of panic as sort of something about this flux in the traditional conceptions of masculinity. The relationship that was traditionally projected between God and man, and this sort of like very strict delineation of the different roles, was being challenged by just the immense power of modern science. People could do things that they'd never been able to do before. And this refracted back through not only just an intellectual idea, but the way the society is structured. The traditional roles of men and women are challenged by these scientific discoveries. And this obviously leaves society in flux. And as that arrives, this is sort of Shelley's novel is piercing that contradiction and that juxtaposition there. So that's important to recognize as well, basically. The way that Shelley's own personal parentage and her experience with sort of the early wave of feminism, how that interacts with the social context of the novel and sort of the greater society that she's discussing. Finally, I want to talk about the economic context. And I've discussed some different areas there that are sort of the traditional foundational tenets that it's important to understand in terms of an economic or sort of a Marxist analysis of any text would be through capitalism, government, and religion, and particularly seeing the different kinds of social upheaval that presented themselves. You can talk about any number of things here. The French Revolution, I think, particularly interesting, and like the rejection of traditional monarchy, if you're sort of talking about the text in terms of more of an analysis of modes of power and the way that people respond to paternalism and power and state authority and things like that. I think the most interesting or the most fertile ground for analysis, and there'd be a lot of stuff online about this, particularly in terms of secondary sources and materials, is the slave trade. This is not just because Shelley had something of a complicated and nuanced relationship, but was essentially an abolitionist. She was arguing against, in some form, the existence of the slave trade from her position in England. But I think it's very important because once you understand it through this idea of this economic analysis of the slave trade, you start to understand this concept of the monster as this sort of subclass of human that is sort of shipped around. The metaphor starts kind of becoming pretty on the nose at that stage as being a metaphor for sort of colonialism and the way that the sort of people were shipped around for their own economic gain. Victor Frankenstein sort of becomes a stand-in then for these like British imperialist authorities that are engaging in the slave trade for their own economic benefit. So I think the slave trade is a particularly important facet of the economic context, but you can fold in any number of these different contextual features there, and I think it's important to do so to supplement your analysis and to make sure it's in top shape for your essay. So look guys, thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. Make sure if you like this video, you subscribe to the channel and you check out the other content on the Ignite feed. Thanks very much.
Hey guys, thank you so much for watching. If you do like the content, subscribe to our channel and we'll have more videos coming your way.
That's right guys, thanks for watching, and please make sure you check out our online resource database. We've had a team of state rank achievers and heads of English put these together for you, covering everything from essay structures and examples all the way through to craft of writing and comprehension skills. So check them out at ignitehse.com.au, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.